Good morning. Welcome to another episode, a morning episode of the Liberty Dad podcast, a discussion on politics and culture. If you're tuning in live, I especially thank you for tuning in so early and giving me your time. You know, I often hear things like, well, I was a libertarian when I was a teenager, or I'm not a libertarian because I like roads. That's a common one, actually. We libertarians, we spend a great deal of time criticizing the way things are, but not really discussing how things might be. So today, I will discuss what that mythical libertarian world might just look like. All right. So, first and foremost, let me apologize for my 2 day absence. I was not here yesterday morning and I did not do an episode Sunday night. The reason being, well, no need for details. Suffice it to say, I had a standard preventative medical procedure that took me away and just kind of kept me from being able to really be productive. Turns out that aging in some ways has its negatives. What do they say? You're 45 now, and if something's not here, if you don't have how this no, it's not how it's if you're 45 and you don't have an ache and pain, one will be around shortly to find you. And that's basically what we've got. So anyway, I'm back, and you can expect me from here on out, Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. in the morning, and then 7 p.m. on Sunday nights with my co-host Susan Hogarth, where we talk about what's going on in the libertarian world. All right. So, first and foremost, what would a libertarian society look like? What's that libertarian utopia? Well, sorry, there's no utopia. But we do believe that we offer a better world nonetheless. And first and foremost, I want to say that what I talk about today is not necessarily like the libertarian view, right? And this is not a precursor to me saying all kind of things that are unlibertarian. That is just me acknowledging that there are other libertarians out there who have this vision of what the world might look like that would look different from mine. Okay, so what I'm trying to do today is just give an example. We're not really trying to say this is exactly what it would look like. It could vary in some ways. It could be what you might think of as more libertarian in some ways. It could be less libertarian in some ways. But ultimately, all I'm trying to do is just kind of lay this kind of like vision out and say, here's here's one way that it might look. Okay. So let's start at the top. And I do mean the top. You might still have a communist China. You might have a theocratic Iran or a more liberal Europe. And of course, the ever so ornery United States, and so on and so forth. All right. So that's what we're talking like libertarian society. Like we would love a libertarian society all over the whole planet. But the reality is, we have no way of achieving that. We can really only focus, at least United States, libertarians in the United States can talk about what it might look like in the United States. So we'll start with that. And we'll point out that other countries may very well not actually have they could have some of the same setup that they have now. Now, for the United States, since we're still at the top here, we're talking kind of globally. We would look at it as one of two ways: non-interventionism at best, or isolationism at, we'll put this in quotations, worst. So not really worst. I know some people see it that way. I had a conversation just this last Sunday. Was it Sunday? No, Saturday. It was Saturday. Our affiliate, I'm the chair here in Duval County. We went out to the local Pride Festival where a bunch of vendors basically set up tables, and we had a table as well. And I ended up talking to a guy, and he accused us of being isolationist. And rather than get into an argument on the definition of it. I just said, look, we're actually not interventionist, and we prefer to have free trade. So, but for since we're at a podcast now, since I can actually, quibble with the definitions, it's a little bit more appropriate here. So I will. So isolationism defined so that we all understand what these words mean when I'm saying them is that it's, and you can look this up, there's no involvement from one country into another's political affairs or their wars. That's a big one. Um, and looking at you, CIA. And then there are no international commitments. Now, that's the big kicker. That's the really big distinction between isolationism and non interventionism is that under isolationism, there is no opportunity for international commitments. So that means we couldn't commit any, say, anything, any economic, political, whatever commitment that you see. So there would be no commitments, there would be no treaties. So we would not be involved in NATO, right? Because we could not engage in an international commitment like that. Non interventionism, however, is very much the same in the sense that there's no involvement in the political affairs of other countries or their wars. Okay. However, it does leave a little bit of room for some international commitments, whatever those might be. So I like to just simply say non interventionism, just because when I talk to people, what I have found is that people think of the word isolationist to mean that we're going to close ourselves up and basically have zero interaction with other countries. And they include specifically economic interaction, which would, basically mean like one company here building stuff and selling it into another country. And it's funny because once I tell people like, no, non-interventionism, which people tend to understand at least the core definition of non-interventionism. They understand that means we do not intervene in the affairs of other countries. So if country A and country B are going to war, then we would stay out of it. So people tend to understand that pretty well. And then you throw in this economic argument where you say, like, look, I'm all about free trade. And then I tell people, I say, when goods cross borders, armies don't. Pretty much those two things, they resolve the you're just isolationist argument. So what that tells me is that a lot of people are operating on an incorrect understanding of the distinction between non-interventionist and non-isolationist. And because of that, I find it easier just to tell them what we mean in general. That tends to get past their arguments. And when you tell people like, "Hey, when goods cross borders, armies don't," I think that's an easy way to help explain that incentives matter, and they do, because if our country is engaging in a lot of trade with another country, well, then we have a lot less reason to go to war, right? Because we're depending on you to build stuff for us, or maybe send over some food, like if you're like an adjacent neighbor right there, or what have you, or maybe even a neighbor from far away, where if you can send the goods over here in such time that they'll still be usable. So so with that, yeah, at the very top, when we're talking about nations, we would be either a non-interventionist or isolationist, depending on the degree. And there could be varying degrees of the non-interventionism, right? There could be some treaties where or some treaties and international commitments that the United States might engage in, and many that are existing now that they would otherwise not at such a time. So that again, just to be clear, I am letting you know that this is not the definition of what a libertarian society would look like. It is just simply trying to lay out kind of what it would look like. All right. All right. So let's go. I keep saying, all right, I got to watch those filler words. Goodness gracious. That hopefully clears up even if I'm using with loose definitions. Now, let's just discuss the United States where I live, because at the end of the day, I cannot control what goes on in another country. I have absolutely no influence into another country because I don't live there. I couldn't even I mean, maybe I could get online and I could convince some other people that some good idea, that this thing is a good idea and they could run with it. But that's the extent of my influence in another country. So I can only talk about where I live because where I live currently, not only can I influence other people through word of mouth and having conversations, this podcast, so on and so forth, but I also have the opportunity to vote, which I don't have in other countries. So it's kind of pointless for me to try to suggest that libertarianism would what it might look like with some other country where I have absolutely no power whatsoever to get it there. So we'll talk about the United States where I live. And first, I do want to, before we start talking about the United States now that we're going to kind of get into it, I want to say that, again, I've been reiterating that there is no one vision of a libertarian society. Now, for simplicity, I want to point out, um, I want to make two distinctions when you think about libertarians. Now, my libertarian peers might argue with me and say, hey, like technically this, technically that. Again, what I like to try to do is talk to everyday average people and make it simple. It's kind of like right now my son is learning to read and write and communicate, and, speak and stuff like that. And sometimes he'll say a word incorrectly, and it's okay. I don't mind it because I know that his goal right now is to just learn a lot, and then as he goes along, he'll learn specifics, right? He'll learn that, oh, this I'm not saying this correctly. For instance, one one of the more common ones is he will say, I think it's for the word backpack, he said pack bag, I think is what it is, pack bag, I think. So it's totally incorrect way of saying backpack. However, I don't make a big fuss over it. We'll say it correctly. We don't, I'll say, hey, go get your backpack. And then sometimes when he says it, he speaks it incorrectly. And I'm not too worried about it because I know that eventually he will he will realize, hey, that is not how that's not how you say this particular word. And this has happened already in the past. Like there have been many words where he started out trying to say them, was not able to enunciate or pronounce them correctly. And then eventually that caught up. So, same thing here. For simplicity, I'm going to use two words to kind of split, this vision of a libertarian society. So, we're going to say anarchism and libertarianism. Okay. Now, for people that are listening or watching that may not know what those words mean or that there even is a distinction, first and foremost, anarchism does not mean, for libertarians at least, it does not mean that there's lawlessness and just people are running around burning down buildings. We're not talking about the Joker in Batman. We're not talking about that kind of like when people say anarchism, they have this vision in mind of just people running around and just doing whatever they want, and there's no rules. Anarchists like to say rules but no rulers. So you can think of that as no state or government as it's understood today. Now, I will leave it up to them to defend what their society might look like. The reason is I'm not an anarchist. I am a libertarian. And again, I'm using definitions here loosely. So don't get mad at me, folks. Trying to make sure that this is easily understood for everyday people. And if they decide to listen to us more, then we can clear up all the distinctions and the nuances. So for libertarianism, you can think of it as a small government. So imagine that our government is like this big. See which one there, put my hand up. So imagine the government is this big, in my opinion, especially the federal government, but government in general. I want it to be more like this big, really, really small, maybe even smaller than that. Maybe we're looking at like this. Okay. So I'm simply distinguishing between two visions here, a vision where there's no government and one where there's a much, much smaller government. And for all intents and purposes, this show, we're going to say anarchism and libertarianism. I fall under the libertarianism definition where I'm really seeking a small government. And maybe one day I will do a podcast episode where I'm discussing my views as that small government libertarian type. So, because no one vision is the vision. It could end up looking very different, or it could vary in many ways from how I describe. So again, we're back at the top here. First and foremost, there is a massive reduction in federal government. That is like the absolute like given. Now, it breaks down into four ways. Some things will go away entirely. Some things are heavily reduced. Some things are delegated back to the states. And then some things would be delegated to the free market. I don't really see anywhere else for things to go. Now, again, this is still a limited government. It's a reduction in scope and, by virtue, employees. And what we're trying to get to for libertarians is to remove the unnecessary spending for things that Americans don't benefit from, or shift some of the responsibility and the spending to a different entity. And that entity would be, again, either the state or potentially even local level, or the free market. So, what kind of things might go away entirely? Well, back in episode 38, you might remember that I did a bill review on House Resolution 40. This was at the federal level. The title of it was Commission to Study and Develop Reparation Proposals for African Americans Act. And if you remember, if you didn't watch that effectively, it authorizes about $12 million to study reparations and then submit their findings. So nobody's actually getting anything. All they're doing is studying it. And the bill goes through and it says, it's kind of interesting because the bill goes through with all the whereas clauses, and it says, whereas this, whereas this, whereas, and part of those whereas clauses that they have, and some of those that are included are things like, slavery existed from this time to this time. Okay, well, that's a given. You don't have to study that, and you don't need the government to write that on paper. We have that. We understand that, right? And it would say, like, when slavery ended, this many 4 million, African Americans were freed. Well, that's a matter of historical record. So again, we don't really need these kind of things. And so then you go on and you read the bill more, and effectively all they're doing is they're setting up a commission to study reparations, the potential impact, and study the historical record um, of slavery. Well, what's interesting that I pointed out in that episode is that you don't need to spend $12 million, because there are plenty of organizations that have already done all of these things. There's organizations that have already went out and said, "Look, I mean, we're fighting right now over what is the real history, right?" There are organizations that have already said, "Look, we've done the research. Here's what the research says has actually happened." Right? So we're talking about the historical record. And then there are organizations that have went out and they've made arguments and said, "Here's why we need reparations, and here is how it could be implemented." Now, I'm not making an argument for reparations. What I'm doing is I'm saying, resolutions like this, bills like this, that simply commission a group to study and submit findings would go away, because you don't need them. They already exist. Right. I think of it this way. I chose this one on purpose because I'm willing to bet that if you could walk up to the average Black American and you said, "Is there an organization that you know of or you trust that could tell me all about slavery?" Bet you most of them could tell you. Right? I mean, maybe not. I mean, some people aren't necessarily plugged into all the different organizations that are out there and stuff like that. But I'm willing to bet that the average Black American could point me in the direction and say, or maybe even a book or an author, right? Like if I wanted to know, if I said, "Hey, I don't know," let's say that, let's do let's do it this way. Let's say aliens came from outer space. So they have no knowledge of things. They came out, they're like, "Oh wow, we found this cool planet Earth." They come down to Earth and they happen to ask, they start hearing about this thing called slavery, and they know that it has to do with Black folk, but they don't know much else. And if these aliens went up to the average Black person and said, "Can you point me in the direction to find more information and learn about this thing that happened called slavery?" The typical Black person I'm willing to bet, could tell them. So we don't need commissions and groups of people to study information, because this information, whether it's for reparations or other things, it's already being studied or already has been, right? Or if it hasn't, it could be very well, because we know this because other things are. So you've got this wasteful spending that's totally unnecessary. That's $12 million. Imagine over the years all of the different commissions that were set up to study something and simply submit a finding. No American has received anything yet. All they've done is said, we're going to go and review the information and compile it together in a document. Well, that's already done. That happens all the time. And the government does it all the time. So imagine all the $12 billion adding up. Somewhere along the line, it's probably quite a bit. I couldn't even guess how much money. Omnibus bills. These bills would go away. Why? Because when the government doesn't have that much to do, they can't pack so much into a bill. Right now, the federal government has so much, like their scope is so large that you can put all sorts of things together and create an omnibus bill. But when you start reducing its authority, its scope, what it has, what it's allowed to do, then you simply just don't need these kind of bills. Like we complain about them and we keep getting them, and Congress keeps passing them. So the easiest way to get rid of them is to remove the situation that allows them to exist in the first place. Let me clear my throat. All right. Moving on. What else could now again, this is not exhaustive. Okay. What else? Various departments could go away. Department of Education, ATF. And this could vary from small handful to even most or even all of them. It's hard to say. Again, this is a generic vision of what the libertarian society might look like. Now, in my opinion, if it's got three letters, we would probably get rid of it. Can't really think of any that I'm really tied to that I don't think could be better served, or could better, that that we couldn't find another way to acquire the information or satisfy any need. Like there are, like, I think that's the kicker, is that libertarians look at the way that we have things now, and we we simply see that it could be accomplished in a different manner. And so that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about accomplishing these things in a different manner. Okay. All right. So now that we've talked about like what kind of things might go away, and there would definitely be more. I mean, I can't sit here on it. I mean, it would take an entire podcast to say, oh, here's all the things that would go away, and it would probably be like a part two and three. Okay. Like there's a lot going on there. So I'm just trying to give some examples and kind of why. Now, what might be heavily reduced? This one's going to get me in a little bit of trouble here because I didn't put it in the what might go away. Again, we are speaking to your regular, average, everyday citizen, and we're not talking about flipping over a society from the perfect libertarian utopia, in my mind, from what we have today. We're talking about like what might it look like in a more nuanced position, because at the end of the day, I have to convince my fellow man and woman that they should push for some of my vision. And in order to do that, I've kind of got to be practical and remember where they are. So this one that might be heavily reduced, the IRS. Now, in my mind, I would totally get rid of it. It would be up there, and the three-letter agencies that I just said would go away. But it could go away entirely, or it could be just a fraction of what it is. And I do mean fraction. Okay. And the reason I say that is because, again, I've stated out from the very beginning that in this libertarian view, you haven't necessarily gotten rid of government entirely. And the government does need to be funded in some way. Now, I know what people are going to say. DL, don't you believe taxation is theft? I absolutely do. But again, I'm talking about a more nuanced vision of what this libertarian society might look like. And again, it could look like all sorts of things, more or less. Hopefully, more. Hopefully, nothing in this. We get to a libertarian society. My hope would be that it would absolutely be at a minimum what I advocate for, or more. Okay. Now, let's talk about the IRS real quick. Did you know the IRS has 93,000 employees? 93,000. That's a lot of employees. And all they do is take your money or come after you to get your money, right? Like if you, I mean, I'm sure that there's more directive there, but if you talk to the average person and you ask them, you say, "What's the IRS do?" They say, "Well, they collect taxes." 93,000 people to make sure you pay money. That's wild. They have a $14 billion annual budget. Or let's think about this for a second. We pay because their money comes from taxes, right? Like they don't get money. They don't have a side hustle. Okay. Maybe some of the IRS agents are on OnlyFans, but the IRS itself does not have a side hustle. They do not get their money from the free market. They get their money from government. And that budget is $14 billion. So part of our taxes are go toward paying for an entity to make sure that we pay our taxes. That's crazy. And the reason I say that it's $14 billion budget annually is because we have so much bureaucracy because the federal government is so huge that of course it's going to take that much. All right. So that's one thing that might be heavily reduced. There'll be other things. Again, we're still kind of at the federal level here. So let's move on to what might be delegated to states. And before I do that, let's stop and let's say some good mornings. I mean, it's 7:30 in the morning, and I'm here talking about the IRS and how a smaller government might look. Like that's just crazy, right? But here I am. So let's get some good mornings in here real quick. We got Hector Roos. Good morning to you, sir. We have Jennifer Schultz. Good morning to you as well. And then, well, Keith hasn't told me good morning, but he's here and he does say good morning often. So no worries there, Keith. But I want to say good morning to everybody. I'm thankful that you guys are tuning in, and hopefully you don't skewer me too hard on anything that I say here. All right. So let's get back. We're talking about what kind of things now, just for anybody that may be tuning in, may want to back up. What I'm doing is I'm saying, all right, what would a massive reduction in federal government look like? And we've already went over things that would go away. We talked about a couple, something that might be heavily reduced. Now let's talk about some things that are going to be delegated back to the states, and then we'll talk about delegated to the free market. So in the delegated back to the states, each state that I know of has a Department of Education. Question is, why do we have a federal one? And if you look at school scores nationally for any given year, pick a year, it doesn't matter. Any given year, it's kind of clear that we aren't getting what we pay for. And how much do we pay? Well, if you thought 14 billion for the IRS was a lot, the Department of Education, the US Federal Department of Education has a $68 billion budget. But here's the really fun part. I looked this up. I'm going to assume that Wikipedia wasn't lying to me because we all know Wikipedia is the bastion of truth. They have just under 4,000 employees. So they have a $68 billion budget with about 4,000. What in the world are they doing with $68 billion? I can tell you what they're not doing. They're not producing high quality students that graduate and are able to read at the level that they graduate or even higher. They're not graduating students. They're not ensuring students graduate um, that are able to uh, do math or understand science at the level for which they graduate, or again higher. So I don't know exactly what we're getting, but I can tell you, in a libertarian society, almost for certain, the Department of Education at the federal level would be gone. And it's funny because, like here in the state of Florida, I have even criticized our Department of Education. So you probably have heard about Florida in the news. We've got like the book ban. It's not technically a ban. What they did was they crafted legislation that made things so difficult that people kind of voluntarily removed things from the shelves because they were afraid of getting in trouble. So it wasn't technically a book ban in that context, but we do have some issues where people can get books removed and stuff like that. And then the other consideration here is that an actual book ban would mean that you could not acquire the book. So not having it in a school is not the same as banning a book. Okay. If the government hasn't said you cannot buy it at a retailer, and has said you are not even allowed to print it, that would actually be a ban. Just removing it from the school is, strictly speaking, not a ban. But I understand where people are coming from. So here in Florida, and actually in many states, there have been a lot of parents that have complained about certain books. Now, I don't know the exact number of books, but it seems to me that it's somewhere in the range of like six or fewer that parents have explicitly said, this book right here is a terrible book. These are the books where parents have went to, city council meetings and school board meetings, and they have read from the book, and they've had their microphones shut off. And then they come out and they go, okay, well, if it wasn't appropriate for me to read publicly, maybe it shouldn't be provided publicly, right? Now, again, I'm not going to get into the argument of the books, but I do want to point out that the books that are in question are in very low numbers. The ones that we know specifically. Okay. That's not to say that there aren't more. What it's to say is the ones that have been specifically found and said this is not appropriate and is generally agreed upon is probably less than six. So here in Florida, our Department of Education, for some reason, was not able to resolve that. Instead, what we had is our governor and our legislature, they passed legislation and said, here's this new bureaucracy that we're going to introduce to deal with like six books. And it kind of annoyed me because I was like, this is exactly how government gets so big. This is why you have governments with atrocious budgets and why they're so ineffective, because we just keep giving them things to do. And for starters, half the time, they're not even able to accomplish it. I mean, we literally have a Department of Education. And my first question was, well, if we have a Department of Education that oversees education to some level, to some degree here in Florida, why was it that they could not communicate to all the schools and say, all right, here's the six books that parents are complaining about. If they're in your schools, you need to remove these six books. That's it. That's all I need to take. No legislation. And in our legislation, in our case, what it did was it created new it created, I don't want to say it created jobs, but in a sense it did. It created a new role for people, and that role would be somebody would have to review books, and there was like criteria under which they review them, and then they would have to give a stamp of approval on these books. And I believe, if I remember the legislation specifically, that the individual, this new role, had to review like every book. This is the reason why books got yanked off the shelves here in Florida, because teachers were like, there was punishment involved. Like had, if you were found to be guilty of allowing a student to have an inappropriate book, and when we're talking about like a seriously inappropriate book, then, and there was ambiguity around that as well, then you could potentially lose your job. And so teachers were like, well, rather than lose my job, I'll just pull all the books off the shelves. Right. And then wait for them to, one by one, go over and say, hey, this book's okay. This book's okay. This book's okay. Right. So again, we went about it in this crazy backward way. So that was the Department of Education at the state level, which I already have a problem with. The federal level, they're even worse. Like, what are they doing? What are we getting for a $68 billion budget? Because for as long as I've been paying attention to politics, you can always look up and say, what are the school scores? And nobody's like, wow, school scores are really rocking it. Students are graduating high school, and look at how well they can read. Look at their understanding of this, of sciences. Look at their understanding of mathematics. That's not happening, and to my knowledge, it's not happened in a very, very long time. So what would be delegated to the states? Say, all right, look, you guys deal with the Department of Education, if you even have one, because at the or at the federal level, it's simply not producing the results that we're looking for. But they do have a $68 billion budget, and who knows what's going on with that money? Maybe somebody should look up. All right, now what would be delegated to the free market? Let me take a sip of water. All right, what kind of things could be delegated to the free market? Well, have you heard of OSHA and the FDA? When I said earlier that we might abolish things, it doesn't mean that the service that they provide would necessarily go away. It might just simply be shifted somewhere else. And saying abolish them when a libertarian says we want to abolish this organization, that doesn't mean that it couldn't pop up in the free market or that it wouldn't be a good idea for it to pop up in the free market. In some cases, I think it might be. So OSHA is the Occupational Standards and Safety and Hazard. I've forgotten it. It's too early to worry about it. But we all know what OSHA is. And then we know what the FDA is. So imagine that those organizations move out of the federal government and they operate more like the NEA, the National Education Association, which is simply a labor union for public school teachers. And it's got roughly under 3 million members. And so what they do is they seek to to operate on behalf of their members, right? And their pay, the NEA gets its funding from member pay. So so OSHA and the FDA, which you might first say, dude, no way, like you couldn't do that. Like they're there to enforce things. Well, here's the catch. Things slip through all the time. I don't know how many drugs have you heard about that had FDA approval and they got pulled from the market? And then maybe the drug manufacturer got in a little bit of trouble. Maybe they had some financial impact, but the FDA didn't. But it was the FDA who let it go through. So how did that happen? Or remember what was that recent movie? It's not a movie. It was a television show. It was like a series, a Netflix series, and it was about um, the opiate crisis. And in there, apparently, there was, um, uh, the company that was making OxyContin. They basically got to this guy that worked at the FDA, right? They were able to like the reason that like the FDA failed, right? So it's I think people have put a little bit more weight into how well these organizations actually produce. And because they do that, they become complacent. And so when you put it out in the free market, there is an incentive to not be so complacent because you could simply have another organization pop up and say, so assume that OSHA, which wasn't necessarily a regulatory body, but instead gave a stamp of approval. And you can think of it this way. I'm going to digress just a wee bit and then I'll come right back. If you go into the grocery store and you're looking at food, how many times have you seen like, hey, this one's kosher, this one's vegan, this one's paleo, so on and so forth, right? This one's gluten free. Uh, there are organizations that verify this, and they are in the free market. So it's as simple as saying, and there's like 5 organizations that do like 80% of the verification for kosher foods. So like 5 of them. And I think that that's 5 like over the entire world. So I don't think they're all 5 necessarily operating in the US. But I could be wrong on that. So imagine that OSHA was in a similar situation where instead of a regulatory body, what they did was they give a stamp of approval. So you have like a little seal that shows up, and that an employer could say, hey, and we'll just use the same name. Hey, we're OSHA certified, or we have the OSHA stamp of approval, which would mean OSHA has come in and instead of being a regulatory body, they've come in and they've verified the work practices. And they say, yep, Company A is adhering to OSHA. Now, let's just say that OSHA, somebody compromised them or that they didn't do their job very well. They got lazy, right? Well, in a free market, then you can have some competing entity that comes in and says, all right, OSHA's garbage. We're going to do it better. And here's going to be our guarantee, right? So there is the incentive where it doesn't exist now because OSHA is a regulatory body and OSHA itself really doesn't get in trouble. The FDA really doesn't get in trouble because they're still there. No matter how many mistakes that they make, they're still there. Okay. You might get a person that's fired here and there, and usually that person tends to be somebody lower level. It so you're not really getting an entity that is forced to do the best job that it can do just like, a decent job. And then it's okay because they're government and, they're not going anywhere. So there's an incentive to, in some ways, do it correctly. But there's also that incentive that, you know what, if we make a mistake, it's okay. Whereas on the free market, which is a very brutal place, you could have an organization that could spring up and basically take over and say, you know what, OSHA, or it could just simply be not only maybe OSHA is doing a good job. Now, again, we're talking about in the free market here. Maybe this free market version of OSHA is doing a good job and they haven't failed, but somebody comes up and they says, hey, you know what, we can do this job even better. We can do this faster, right? And we can still provide the same results, or we can provide even better results. This kind of thing is possible in the free market, but right now, the way that it works, the government has a monopoly on these kind of things. And when you have monopoly, you basically get to say how things play out. You basically get to dictate that, you know, we stay in business. OSHA will not go out of business. The FDA will not go out of business for failure to do their job. And it doesn't matter how many mistakes they make. And it seems kind of weird, but we kind of do that already. As I pointed out, you know, you go to the grocery store and if you're trying to eat the paleo diet, you can find the little sticker that says, it's not a sticker, but the little icon on the food that says paleo. You can look and see, oh, this is vegan. That means I can consume this because I'm a vegan, or I'm adhering to kosher diet. So therefore you can look and find the kosher emblem on there. And it exists beyond the grocery store. You may have walked into an automotive shop and seen the little blue kind of like circle star-ish looking emblem. I think it's actually a gear. And it says ASE. Well, that's the automotive service excellent. And that is an emblem that says that, hey, this person or this company adheres to certain requirements, right? Like they have met these particular conditions and we verify them. Okay, whatever those conditions are. And you have these kind of organizations all over the place. Engineering has them, doctors have them. There's all these kind of organizations that give us benefit. But here's the interesting thing. If you think about it for a moment, while we do have these, people tend to overlook them. And the reason that we overlook them is because we just assume the government's going to take care of it. And we're going to get to that. We're going to talk more about that in just a moment. Okay. Now, another way that these things could be in the free market. When I used to work at a company. It was a fastener company, and we were a warehousing company. And we delivered fasteners to different manufacturers. And one of our customers, who is like the bread and butter, our customer now, they came out and they said, "All right, we're doing this diversity thing, right?" And I think this was back before you had your ESGs and all this stuff. Like this was just when like diversity was kind of getting started. They came out and they said, look, we want to know that it's in your processes, in your formal documentation, that you are a company that that doesn't discriminate. And I think it was relatively simple. Like they didn't go out and say you had to have quotas and all this stuff. They just wanted to know, like, hey, you're not discriminating, because otherwise we don't want to do business with you. So on the free market, not only could you have some of these things like OSHA and FDA operating in the free market and then offering a stamp or a seal of approval in some sense, you could also have companies that say, like, look, I'm a big behemoth company, and this company here is one of my suppliers. And I want to make sure that you are also certified by this free market version of OSHA or the free market version of the FDA. And if you're not, then I no longer want to work with you. And so then the smaller company has to make a decision. They have to say, well, do we want to work with this big company who may be our bread and butter, or do we not? So there are many ways in which the free market could accomplish the very same things. Because again, it's not that libertarians necessarily want them all to go away. This idea of anarchy, of in the context of just lawlessness and just rampant, everything goes and nobody cares and there's nobody to stop anything. That is, for one, that's not what we believe at the libertarian level, and it's definitely not what they believe at the anarchist level, right? They have an entirely different view, as do we in this split of the anarchist and libertarian view of society. So now, so after that, we've discussed the four things that would reduce government. Now, the same thing could apply at the state level. Some things would be gone, some things may be reduced, and some things may be delegated to to lower governments, the city and in city and county governments, and there could be some things on the free market. Now, I'm not going to go over all of those because we are getting close to our time, but I did want to point out that what could happen at the federal level could easily happen at the state level. Hold on, sorry about that, folks. Having a little bit of trouble with my voice. Now, the big question that people love to ask libertarians, and it drives us crazy, is, well, who will build the roads? Well, the answer is very simple. Same people that do now, because the government contracts out that labor. Government doesn't have its own entity that builds roads. There's no like road building division. They contract out that labor to other companies that build the roads. Now they may put down, there's all kind of things that are involved there. They may say, "Okay, here's some requirements that we've determined, blah blah blah," but ultimately they're not building the roads. They pay for the roads. So the real question is, who will pay for the roads? And that answer is developers, people that are developing, and that happens already. If you see an area that gets cleared out for a new shopping center, you know who's paying for everything in there? Well, I mean, subsidies aside, but who's paying for it all? It's the developer. The developer is basically one giant general contractor that reaches out and finds other contractors to come and do the job. So they go out and they say, "All right, you're going to build the buildings, you're going to do the roads, you're in, and you're going to manage building the buildings." And then that person might go out and say, "Okay, well, I need to get some people that can do some construction. Need people that can do some framing and some electricity and some plumbing, so on and so forth." Right. So this already happens. Like, and that's the thing about libertarians is it's not that we're envisioning this world that is so drastically different. I mean, in some ways it would be very drastically different, but in other ways it would operate very similar to what we have now. You would just simply not have the power of government running it. It would simply be on the free market, which I've expressed is very brutal. Other people that might pay for the roads, private ownership. There could simply be somebody that says, you know what, I'm going to start a business. I'm going to get some people that will give me money. I will find some investors, and then I will be responsible for seeking out and building roads, maintaining them, and then that person could be responsible for the maintenance of those roads. They would be responsible for who gets to be on those roads, in which we have toll roads already, and that's what I mean by who gets to be on it. They may say, "Hey, if you're going from point A to point B, then maybe you get charged this amount of money. But if you're going from point A to point C, then you get charged a different amount of money, so on and so forth." Right? There's various ways under which this could be managed and effectively paid for, and you're already paying for it. You just don't pay for it directly. So therefore, it seems like for many people that the government is actually doing all the paying, but it's not. You're actually paying for it. And maybe someday I'll do a conversation on how you could have organizations that pop up and say, "All right, look, if you join our organization, we will make sure that you have access to all these roads, and you will have access to this, and you will have access, and you have access." And so then it becomes very similar to, you pay one entity and you get a whole bunch of things for it, right? And again, we have those too. AAA, you pay AAA money and they will come out and they will provide you a whole bunch of services, right? If your car breaks down. So um and to the chagrin of me and many other libertarians, who will pay for the roads. Yep, maybe even some level of government, right? I mean, remember at the very beginning, I did say that under the more libertarian view, government doesn't necessarily go away. That's anarchism. And if you have the government here, then it's probably paying somebody at some level, maybe very limited. Again, I said that my vision is that the government goes from like this big to like this big, very, very tiny, especially at the federal level. So the real question is, who will pay for the roads? And there's various options for who can pay for the roads, but the roads would not necessarily be paid for in the same way. Because if you think about it, or if you go research it, not think about it, if you go research it, you'll find out that because the federal government pays for roads, and they also provide money to states to help fund and pay for those roads, they also add strings every so often. And so if you research it, you'll find that there have been cases where the government says, "Oh, Florida, you don't want to do this. Be a shame if some of that highway funding weren't coming your way, right? So they kind of bully states by using that money. It's crazy, right? So what we're trying to do is we're trying to get rid of some of that nonsense so that the money that we pay as individuals goes specifically to the services and the products that we want and not the bureaucracy that happens. All right, now this list is not expansive. And I know that some libertarians would disagree with me. Some of them would go further, much, much further. Some of them might have different priorities, right? They might say, okay, well, some might say, I wouldn't necessarily get rid of the Department of Education, although I will say I don't know any libertarians that would say that, but let's just assume there would be one. So there might be a libertarian who says, well, I don't think that we should entirely get rid of the Department of Education at the federal level, but instead of a $68 billion budget, maybe they can operate on a $500 million budget and they can do a few things, right? Like the vision here is not it is neither exhaustive nor is it the vision. It is simply going from where we are to something else by shifting things around, getting rid of other things. We are our the biggest thing that libertarians want to do, no matter what that vision looks like, though, is move bureaucracy from government to the free market. The more, the better. And the reason, because the market has a lot less tolerance for waste. Now, there is waste in the market, like the free market does have waste, but it doesn't have waste nearly in the same way that government does. And that's because in the free market, that money is effectively always somebody. There's always some person that is explicitly responsible for that money, and they have that duty in there, and they have to respond in a way or they lose their job. If I'm working and I'm a manager at my job and I'm responsible for a budget, if I misuse that budget, my company will fire me. Not so much the case in government. So what we want to do is we want to move things to the free market where it can operate better and with less tolerance for waste. Okay. Um, there is simply the free market reduces incentives for things like lobbyists, right? There's no need for them because in the free market, again, as I mentioned earlier, something rather than a lobbyist, you could have another entity pop up and say, "Well, you're not doing the job so well, so I'm going to do it, or I can do the job better." It incentivizes competition. Let's see. Do I have time for that story? Let me think. I don't know. Yeah, I'll give you a story real quick about how we incentivize competition. Let's talk about healthcare. So a long time ago, and we're not going to get into all the details, but a long time ago, I found out that I had an inner ear problem. I still do, and it affected both ears. And so in my research, I realized that this was a relatively rare condition. In doing that, I realized that there were a limited number of doctors that I could even see. Right, this is not as simple as going to your regular ear, nose, throat doctor. You start there maybe, and so I started doing my due diligence and going out and I did the research, and then I did go to an ear, nose, and throat doctor just to kind of get the process started. But I knew that wasn't going to be who was going to be resolving it. Now it's funny. He actually disagreed at first. He said, "Well, I don't know if you really have this thing, but I'm going to send you to get, I think it was a PET scan. I'm going to send you to get a scan and we'll see." And he said, because this is what he said, the constellation of symptoms that you're describing is interesting. So he sent me, I went and I got my scan. I came back with my follow up. And this doctor said, "Well, I disagree. I don't think that you have this condition that's very visible that can be seen on I think it was, I don't know, was it a CAT scan? I can't remember. It was one of those scans." And he said, "But the radiologist said so. He agrees. So therefore, I'm going to defer to the radiologist. So now I'm going to refer you to this specialist who deals with this kind of thing." So he referred me to the specialist. I went to the specialist and he wanted to go a particular path. And I said, "Well, based on my research, I'm not so sure that's the best path for me." So in my research, I had found this doctor out of Louisiana. And I said, "I want to go to this doctor. So for a second opinion." So I went out to this doctor. Now, this doctor, he is a guy that has written extensively about this condition. People have come to him from other countries. Like people have literally flown from like Australia and from, I think, England. One story, like a kid, because of the condition that he had with his inner ear was so bad that he had to like fly on a plane, laying down in a certain way in order for it to be comfortable. Like it was a really crazy situation, right? So people come to this doctor from all over the world to be treated for this particular condition. And so I went to him as a second opinion and found out he actually doesn't take insurance. Now, because he operates in the free market, he was like his company or his business gave me a list of everything that I would be charged for. So they're like, here's all the things that we plan on doing for your initial screening, and then here's the charge, and it's not going to be a penny more. Okay. So, when I say that it incentivizes competition, I'm talking about things like this, where he was on the free market. I was able to go to this doctor. And then, just to kind of wrap up this story a little bit, his office helped me navigate the insurance company because I did have to submit to my insurance company to get refunded. Right. It's just that I couldn't, the way it wasn't going to work is I go to them, they bill my insurance company, and then send me a bill for the remaining. It was kind of the opposite. Instead, they sent me a bill, and then I would send my information to the um, to the uh, to the insurance company, and then the insurance company would determine how much they were willing to refund me, and then I knew my final cost. So a little bit differently. So it incentivizes competition in that same way when we put things into the free market, because now people can identify and do things better. And the reason that I went to this doctor and the reason that I ultimately had the procedure done with this doctor is because in his second opinion, he sat me down and he said, here is why. And he laid it all out for me. Like I wasn't just like, oh, this guy's smart. And he has a lot of education. He knows what he's talking about. No, he explained everything and exactly why he felt that the procedure that he needed, which is a little bit more surgical, the procedure that he would do would be the one that I would want. Okay. And that's what I'm talking about when I talk about these things like OSHA and FDA being shifted to the free market, is now we have them and somebody else can compete with them. And then us as the consumer can go to a place and say, hey, this place uses only FDA food. This restaurant, oh, I'm sorry, this entity only uses um, the free market version of FDA approved food. you know, this place has the ASE certification. Therefore, I want to take my car there. These kind of things. And because you don't have lobbyists, because you don't have all this government bureaucracy, it becomes more important for us citizens to know about, okay, where do I want to go? And why do I want to use this particular business? And why is this particular seal of approval so important? And that is because, getting this all wrapped up, there is no libertarian utopia. At the end of the day, you get more control over your life because you own yourself. However, you have more responsibility. So it's not a utopia, because with that control comes naturally more responsibility. If I want to know which doctor, or if I want to make a decision, my decision, which doctor should be treating me, then that means I have to put a little more effort, a little more responsibility into knowing who the doctors are. Why is this doctor better than another doctor? Why is his opinion or her opinion better than the opinion? Why is this second opinion better than the first opinion or the third opinion, what have you? Right. So there is no libertarian utopia. But all the things that we currently enjoy in society, and I say enjoy, I mean, like we think of OSHA as being there to protect us from bad workers. These things could easily be shifted to the free market, and we have so many examples of them already. So it's not like we're creating a world that doesn't already in part exist. You have some um, consumer reports. Many people go to consumer reports before they buy a car, before they buy a vacuum. Right? Like simple things, like a vacuum is not a big deal, but they might say, you know what? Consumer Reports has tested all these vacuums, and here are the criteria that they use to test them, and here are the results. So therefore, I want to buy vacuum A, right, or B. These things already exist in society. So when people scoff and they make jokes and they say, "Oh, I was a libertarian when I was a teenager," and they suggest like libertarianism is for kids and it's not for adults, it's just nonsense, because it absolutely is for adults, because adults need to exercise responsibility. All right, folks. I hope that you enjoyed watching this episode. I enjoyed giving it. And again, I will be, you can be sure to catch me every morning, Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. For Eastern Time for an informed discussion on politics and culture. And then again on Sundays at 7 p.m. with my co-host, Susan Hogarth. We will discuss LP happenings. We're going to look out across the United States and we're going to figure out what's going on in different libertarian parties, whether it's at the state level or the local level, and we're going to bring it to you. Now, it might sound boring, but what we're hoping to do is promote the idea of telling people what's going on and then also give people ideas. I've already heard from some people. They're like, wow, I didn't know that this was happening in another state. That's a really cool idea. I thought about it myself when I reported that another affiliate was having a homeschool. Somebody was coming in to speak about homeschool, and then inviting the people within their community to come and hear about it. Because if we're going to talk about abolishing the Department of Education or revamping in some way how we do education and encourage people to homeschool, then it's on us to kind of say, oh, by the way, here's a talk that you can come to and hear about how that homeschool would work and how maybe it's not so much so difficult as you might think. All right. I want you to be sure to do all the proper audience activities, actions. Like, check this out. I want you. Can I get them? Yeah, right there. Check out my my right over my face. So you got YouTube, and then you've got Rumble here. Again, folks, I'm still working on Rumble. But if you would go to rumble.libertydad.com and you would subscribe to my channel, once I get 20 subscriptions, I believe, then I will be able to go from that crazy string of letters and numbers for my channel name to an actual real name. And that would be super fabulous. And probably within the next week or so, you will start seeing things popping up on Rumble. But in the meantime, you can always go to youtube.libertydad.com to watch the show and make sure that you do all the cool things, ring the bell, like my videos. Tell me something in the comment section. Tell me where I got something wrong. Tell me where I got something right. I mean, whatever the case. And you can follow me, Liberty Dad, on Facebook. But if you really want, I would go with Liberty Dad Pod on X, what you might used to remember as Twitter. You can also email me, libertydadpodcast@gmail.com, because I would love to hear from you. Remember, folks, if you're a champion of liberty, your business is people and your product is liberty. I want you to have a great week. Catch you next time. And I'm out as soon as I find my buttons to click me out.